welcome to History House. I'm your host, Owen Delaney. Let's begin. Today we will be talking about a monarch, and by extension a nation, that doesn't always come to mind when thinking about the Middle East. King Hussein I and the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan. I have a few reasons for choosing this subject. In terms of Jordan, some members of my family have spent time there, while on the 25th of May, a few days ago, Jordan celebrated its 79th Independence Day. More broadly speaking, the region of the Middle East has received renewed attention, namely through the scenes unfolding before our eyes in Gaza, and while I have a specialty in Ottoman/Turkish history, I wanted to explore this geographic area more broadly, in a manner that at least touches upon the geopolitical realities of how Israel, Palestine, Egypt and Jordan became the way they are today. To do this, I wanted to focus on a single individual whose life could, in some ways, mirror the political developments of the region, and I found that exploring the life of King Hussein I of Jordan could be a useful lens to examine the Middle East as a whole, and also to understand why the Kingdom of Jordan has largely avoided the conflict and violence that its neighbours have tragically encountered. His life and reign, from 1952 to 1999, reflects the history of this region, and alongside my previously outlined reasons, this year marks the 90th anniversary of the King's birth. I hope that over the next while or so, you will learn about the life of this consequential monarch, coming away with a better understanding of Jordan generally, and will be better able to grasp why the Middle East, particularly Egypt, Israel, Palestine, Lebanon, and of course Jordan, came to be the way they are today. There is certainly a lot to get through, so without any further ado, let's go, or as they say in Jordan, Yalla Bina. Before talking about the life of King Hussein properly, I think a background on Jordan, and by extension its ruling family, is necessary. Jordan, or the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan, as it is officially known as, dates back to 1946 as an independent country, but its history is very much entwined with its namesake dynasty. The Hashemites, or the House of Hashem, are a royal family that trace their ancestry to Hashem, the great-grandfather of the Prophet Muhammad, the key figure in the religion of Islam. As such, this family has played an important role in the history of this religion, and they would act as guardians to the Islamic holy sites in Mecca and Medina, when these cities were under Ottoman rule. The Hashemites would greatly expand their influence during the First World War, when they decided to revolt against Ottoman rule and align with the British on the promise that post-war there would be an independent Arab kingdom. The Great Arab Revolt is most commonly associated with the figure of Lawrence of Arabia and the famous 1962 film, which was filmed on location in Jordan itself. And while the leader of the revolt was on paper Hussein bin Ali, the Sharif of Mecca, the real driving force behind it was his son, Faisal, portrayed by Alec Guinness in Lawrence of Arabia, a problematic portrayal from the lens of today in brownface, but that's another story. Unbeknownst to Faisal was the Sykes-Picot Agreement between Britain and France, which arranged for the partitioning of the Middle East into British and French zones post-World War I, rendering promises of Arab independence to be null and void. To this effect, the areas of Lebanon and Syria would fall under French influence, whereas Iraq and the historical region of Palestine would fall under British authority. In spite of this arrangement, the Hashemites would play an important role in this new political order of the Middle East, but not through a single family member, such as through Faisal. He was not the only son of Hussein, the Sharif of Mecca, with two others playing crucial political roles. The eldest was Ali, who succeeded his father as king of the Hejaz, the area of the Arabian Peninsula consisting of the holy cities of Mecca and Medina, and the important port of Jeddah in 1924, following his abdication. Ali himself would be overthrown the following year when the House of Saud conquered the region from their base in Riyadh, creating the modern-day Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. He himself would pass away in the Kingdom of Iraq in 1935 with Iraq being ruled by the Faisal branch of the Hashemite family, following Faisal's brief stint as king of Syria in 1920 until his overthrow by French authorities in that year. The link between Iraq and Jordan, especially the connections between the two branches of the Hashemites, will be important later on, so keep it in mind as we continue with this episode. Then there was the middle child of Hussein the Sharif of Mecca, Abdullah. Deprived of a kingdom in his own right, he set his sights on the area between the River Jordan, which was in theory governed by the British Mandate of Palestine, but had largely been left to its own devices. In March 1921, Abdullah arrived in Amman, the future capital of Jordan, but then a relatively small town, which threatened British plans of governing the area west of this river as part of their mandate. That same month, the British Colonial Secretary, Winston Churchill, a name familiar to many students of history, offered the area east of the Jordan to Abdullah, on condition that he renounce his claims to reconquer Syria for the Hashemites and recognise British authority over the area west of the River Jordan. Thus, with a quote, stroke of the pen, as Churchill later called it, the Emirate of Transjordan was created, a state that was very much dependent on British protection and support, owing to the Saudi presence on its borders. It was within this environment that the future king, Hussein, was born in the year 1935, the grandson of Abdullah I, through his son, the future king Talal. Talal was born in 1909, and as the eldest son of Abdullah I, was positioned to succeed his father as the Emir of Transjordan. Despite this, the relationship between father and son was not cordial. Talal, despite being educated at Sandhurst in the UK, would later harbour resentment to the British, which contrasted with his father's views especially. Further, Talal would over time exhibit signs of mental illness, something that Abdullah, being the physically well and healthy man that he was, could not understand, and something that would come under greater scrutiny when Talal finally ascended the throne. Of course, our understanding of mental health has greatly evolved from this time, but during this period it was greatly stigmatised and would have been seen as an excluding factor to succession. As such, Hussein, despite being second in line to the throne, appears to have been seen by his grandfather as a more suitable successor, aligning with his views and his beliefs. Alongside his grandfather, Abdullah I, the future King Hussein's mother, Zayn al-Sharif bin Jamal, would play an important role in his own life. She herself was actually a first cousin of Talal, as her husband was a nephew of Hussein bin Ali, the previously mentioned Sharif of Mecca, who was the father of Abdullah I. And unlike a number of women of her time, she was well educated and was fluent in 4 languages. She was also seen as a woman with a modern outlook, contrasting with the traditionalism of previous generations, undoubtedly shaping her son Hussein's own outlook too. She would play an important role in his own life, even after he became king, right up until her death in 1994. On the 25th of May 1946, the Emirate of Transjordan became the Kingdom of Transjordan, as it became an independent state, and Emir Abdullah I became King Abdullah I. The next few years will play a key role in shaping the new kingdom, especially the year 1948. That year, the mandate for the British governance of the neighbouring territory of Mandatory Palestine was due to expire, and questions were being asked about the governance of the area post-British withdrawal. The newly established United Nations had suggested the partition of the area in 1947 between Arabs and Jews who had immigrated to the area from the beginning of the century, which accelerated following the horrors of the Holocaust during the Second World War. When the Arabs rejected the plan, the stage was set for a conflict when the British mandate expired at midnight on the 14th of May 1948. From that moment, war erupted between the newly established State of Israel and surrounding Arab states, with Transjordan joining in the fight. In general, the war was a disaster for the Arabs, being referred to as the Nakba, or the catastrophe, by Palestinians, owing to their displacement from the lands that they had lived in for centuries. But out of all the Arab states, Jordan can be viewed as the one who lost the least, even gaining territory. Its army, the Arab Legion, had been professionally trained by the British, allowing it to fight more effectively than its Arab neighbours and managing to add the West Bank and East Jerusalem to the kingdom. As such, the name of the state was to be changed from Transjordan to simply Jordan, given that it now extended beyond the River Jordan. The population of the kingdom also greatly expanded, with the addition of 1.5 million people, including 458,000 Palestinian refugees, ensuring that the question of Palestinians, and indeed a Palestinian state, will become an important part of Jordanian politics for the decades to come. Abdullah I's reign beyond this conflict would also be short-lived. On the 28th of July 1951, he was assassinated at point-blank range while visiting the Al-Aqsa Mosque in Jerusalem by a Palestinian called Mustafa Ashu, apparently because of the contacts that the king had had with Israel, despite the state of war existing between the two nations. Ashu was killed on the spot by Abdullah I's bodyguards, with Hussein witnessing this assassination firsthand. In spite of Abdullah I's close relationship with his grandson, the throne would pass to Talal, albeit for a brief period. Despite his general affection as the monarch who instituted Jordan's 1952 constitution, which still exists today and made Jordan a de jure constitutional monarchy, his mental illness began to play an increasing role in his responsibilities. Following Abdullah's assassination in July 1951, Talal had been in Geneva receiving treatment and was not deemed well enough to handle the crisis, but he eventually succeeded his father in September 1951. By March 1952, his condition seriously deteriorated again, marked by paranoid delusions and violence, leading doctors to advise that his young children needed to be kept away from him for their own safety. He was eventually persuaded to leave for Paris, but refused hospitalization there. His son, Hussein, attempted to calm him and persuade him to accept treatment, but Talal attacked Hussein with a knife. It was generally agreed that Talal was suffering from schizophrenia and that his behaviour was making it impossible for him to govern effectively. Consequently, on the 11th of August 1952, a special session of Parliament was convened. A committee was appointed to review the medical evidence regarding Talal's condition, and based on the committee's recommendation, Parliament made the decision to terminate his rule and declare Prince Hussein his successor. Talal accepted this decision and left the country on the 16th of September 1952. At first, Talal departed the country for Egypt, where it was intended for him to receive an extended period of treatment. However, following a serious car accident in July 1953, Talal was relocated to a private home in the Ortaköy district of Istanbul, where he would eventually pass away in 1973 at the age of 63, coincidentally the same age that his son Hussein would pass away too. As a consequence of this crisis, followed by the recent assassination of King Abdullah I, King Hussein now ruled Jordan at the young age of 17. Hussein had been a student of Harrow in the United Kingdom from September 1951 to July 1952, and while he was now king, he was not yet 18, which meant that he could not yet assume full responsibilities as the ruler of Jordan. As such, he would take part in an officer's training course at Sandhurst Military Academy, the UK's premier officer training academy for its army, from September 1952 until February 1953, when he turned 18, according to the Western calendar, an experience that would shape his character and define his relationship with the personnel of the Jordanian military. Finally, on the 2nd of May 1953, the king turned 18 according to the Islamic calendar and was consequently crowned on that day assuming full constitutional responsibilities as monarch. The new king had now entered a dangerous world wherein relations between the states of the Arab world were becoming increasingly fragmented, and various nations battled each other both politically and sometimes literally for power and influence. The previous year, 1952, saw the overthrow of the Egyptian monarchy through the 23rd of July revolution, and after a power struggle between various members of the Egyptian military, Lieutenant Colonel Gamal Abdel Nasser became President of Egypt in 1954. His presidency would have dramatic consequences for the Arab world and marked the region-wide popularity of Arab socialism. This was a movement that was anti-imperialist in nature and Arab nationalist, and aimed for the unification of the Arab world, pan-Arabism, under the leadership of a strong leader, i.e. Nasser. Through the lens of this ideology, King Hussein, and indeed other monarchs, would have no place in the political affairs of the Middle East, who had close ties to Western powers, and many of Hussein's initial challenges would be related to his ties with Jordan's former overlord, Britain. In 1955, the Baghdad Pact was created as a defence alliance between the Republic of Turkey and the Kingdom of Iraq, whose dynasty was a branch of the Hashemite family. Later, Britain and Iran joined the pact, and it began to be increasingly seen as an anti-Soviet alliance, a NATO of the Middle East, if you will. Owing to his ties with Iraq, King Faisal II was a cousin of King Hussein, and both attended Harrow together and were to become close friends. As well as political pressure from Britain, King Hussein was inclined to join this organisation. Nasser of Egypt, however, was vehemently against this, seeing it as a tool by Britain to control the Middle East and as a distraction from what he saw as the main threat in the region, Israel. Nasser himself would fight against France, Israel and the UK during the Suez Crisis of 1956, when he decided to nationalise the Suez Canal. Similarly, Saudi Arabia opposed the pact owing to its border disputes with the UK, as well as the previously mentioned tensions it had had with the two branches of the Hashemite family in Jordan and Iraq. When riots broke out in Jordan itself over the possibility of joining, some also feared that Israel would be a member of this pact, King Hussein finally decided against joining it, thus ending this early test in his reign. Despite not joining the Baghdad Pact, many Jordanians, and by extension other Arab states, believed that Jordan's continued ties with the UK were still strong. While Jordan gained formal independence from Britain in 1946, there was still significant British influence in the kingdom, most evident in its armed forces. Jordan's military, as we mentioned, was called the Arab Legion, and many key positions were occupied by British military personnel. While this made the Arab Legion a formidable fighting force in terms of training and discipline, allowing it to gain territory during the 1948 war with Israel, questions were naturally asked as to how much of the army King Hussein actually controlled, rather than the British. Therefore, as 1955 became 1956, and still reeling from the Baghdad Pact fiasco, King Hussein decided to dismiss the Commandant-General of the Arab Legion, John Bagot Glubb, commonly known as Glubb Pasha, which he did on the 1st of March 1956. While this had huge consequences in terms of Anglo-Jordanian relations, the reaction of the British Prime Minister, Anthony Eden, was described as, quote, almost hysterical. It significantly boosted Hussein's standing both in Jordan and across the region. Indeed, the American ambassador to Amman would note, quote, the action has gone far toward removing Jordan's defensive position and inferiority complex vis-à-vis the Arab states. King is now hero and no longer puppet. End quote. While it was a dramatic boost for the Hashemite dynasty of Jordan and allowed for the Arabization of its armed forces, including the renaming of the Arab Legion to the Jordanian Arab Army, the vacuum created by the departure of British officers led to the appointment of Jordanian military personnel to high positions, some of whom didn't necessarily view King Hussein and the idea of monarchy that he represented as the best course for Jordan's future. This tension was not only present in the military, but would also extend to the political sphere too, as it was also in 1956 that Jordan would hold parliamentary elections on the 21st of October. 40 seats were available, and out of that, left-wing parties secured 17 of those seats. Consequently, the left-wing bloc would form a government with the leader of the National Socialist Party, which secured 12 of those seats, Suleiman Nabulsi, becoming Prime Minister. His political outlook was very much the same as that of Nasser in Egypt, and as such his tenure would mark sharp disagreements with King Hussein, leading to an eventual showdown that would play out from late 1956 to early 1957. Starting with Nabulsi's government seeking to form diplomatic relations with the Soviet Union and later dismissing officials trusted by the monarchy, including the chief of the Royal Diwan, these tensions became plain for all to see. Further, the pro-Nasserist factions in the military had become more emboldened following Egypt's apparent victory in the Suez Crisis, creating a joint political military challenge to the continued rule of the Hashemite dynasty in Jordan. This would come to a head in April 1957 during the Zarqa affair, in which both an official version and a revisionist version exist as to what actually happened. For the purposes of presenting as much evidence as possible, I will describe both versions. According to the official history, Ali Abu Nuwar, the army chief of staff, and the free officers, with the support from the Nabulsi faction, planned a military coup against the monarchy. On the 8th of April, the 1st Armoured Car Regiment surrounded the capital, Amman, and while Nabulsi resigned on the 10th of April, an intercepted cable, reportedly from Nasser, urged him not to give in. On the 13th of April, after King Hussein asked Saeed al-Mufti to form a new government, Abu Nuwar and colleagues summoned Mufti to the military barracks at Zarqa and delivered an ultimatum to the king: appoint an acceptable government or face army rebellion. Abu Nuwar then personally delivered this ultimatum to the palace. According to this version, loyal officers arrived from Zarqa and warned the king that units commanded by Nathir Rashid and Man Abu Nuwar were ordered to move to Amman to surround the palace and arrest him. Receiving reports that troops in Zarqa were out of control and rumours of his death were spreading, King Hussein, his uncle, and Ali Abu Nuwar went to Zarqa immediately. At Zarqa, the king was mobbed by loyalist troops shouting, "Down with communism, death to Abu Nuwar and all the traitors." Ali Abu Nuwar reportedly broke down, cried and begged for his life. The king allowed Abu Nuwar to leave for Damascus with his family and appointed General Ali al-Hiyari in his place, thus ensuring Hussein's continued rule and support. On the other hand, there is another version that tells a different story. Some believe that it was actually a royal coup staged by King Hussein himself against radical nationalist soldiers and politicians, with the king instigating the unrest through loyal Bedouin officers to discredit the nationalists. Whatever the actual course of events, King Hussein's rule was now secure, internal threats had been suppressed, and political parties would be banned from the 25th of April following the declaration of martial law, and would remain banned until 1992, following the lifting of martial law in 1991. Hussein's continued rule would contrast dramatically with the fate of his cousin, King Faisal II. While both Jordan and Iraq would form a short-lived federation in February 1958, anti-royalist factions in the Iraqi military would grow until on the 14th of July of that year, a coup was launched, overthrowing the monarchy, with King Faisal II and Crown Prince Abdullah being shot dead. This would naturally come as a tremendous shock to King Hussein. He would, at a news conference, describe the murder of his, quote, cousin, brother, and childhood playmate, King Hussein of Iraq, and all his royal family. It would also lead to the reformulation of Jordan's diplomatic relations and alliances. Jordan was now the only surviving state still ruled by the Hashemites, reduced from the Hejaz, Iraq, and briefly Syria, and gone was its closest ally against the threat of Nasser. Britain, owing to Jordan's non-participation in the Baghdad Pact, the dismissal of Glubb Pasha, and Britain's diminishing influence in the region following the Suez Crisis, it was clearly not a viable ally. As such, Jordan would need to reorientate its diplomatic connections beyond the Middle East, specifically to the nation which had taken on the superpower position that Britain once had, namely the United States. The 1950s, following on from the 1940s, saw the continuation of the Cold War, in which the US and Soviet Union would fight an ideological battle, and physical fighting taking place indirectly through proxies, owing to the mad theory with nuclear weapons if these two superpowers were to engage in direct conflict. One of the theatres of the Cold War was across the Middle East, in which both nations jostled for influence. While Israel was naturally seen as an ally of the US, Egypt, owing to Nasser, was seen as susceptible to Soviet influence. Jordan, as a kingdom, was a possible ally of the US, but King Hussein's relative youth made the United States cautious about making commitments to support him. It was only in the aftermath of April 1957 that the Eisenhower administration saw that King Hussein was capable of maintaining power, having survived a serious threat to his continued rule, and on the 29th of April, a $10 million grant of US financial aid was announced for Jordan, with military hardware being airlifted to the kingdom in September of that same year. Further, less overt aid would also be supplied by the CIA through a monthly sum of 5,000 Jordanian dinars, about 14,000 US dollars. This would mark the beginning of Operation No Beef, in which the CIA would provide direct payments to King Hussein to, quote, beef up his reign, with the money ultimately destined for individuals within his army and intelligence service. Under the CIA's system of pseudonyms and cryptonyms, No stood for Jordan and Norman for King Hussein, and this would allow the CIA to operate in the kingdom, as well as providing the US with a strong footing in the Middle East. The existence of this operation would become public knowledge when the journalist Bob Woodward wrote a front-page story published in the Washington Post on the 18th of February 1977. By that time, the subsidy had been reduced in 1976 and ended completely when Jimmy Carter assumed the presidency, but nonetheless raised questions about the nature of the relationship between Jordan and the United States. Alongside the dismissal of Glubb Pasha, the April 1957 crisis, and the beginning of a close relationship between the US and Jordan, King Hussein would marry Dina bint Abdul Hamid in 1955. They were distant cousins, and Dina's father had moved to Egypt after the kingdom of the Hejaz was conquered by the Saudi royal family in 1925. Like King Hussein, she had also been educated in the United Kingdom, and she received a degree in English literature from Girton College, Cambridge, and a postgraduate diploma in social science from Bedford College, London. Indeed, the future couple first met in London. Despite giving birth to the King's first child, Alia, in 1956, theirs was a strained marriage, with Dina supposedly being sympathetic to Nasser, and she would tease King Hussein, supposedly, for supporting the, quote, colonisers, the British. When Dina went to visit her father in Egypt in 1956, she was blocked from returning to Jordan, with King Hussein telling her she had, quote, better stay where you are. Divorce papers were served through the Jordan ambassador in Cairo, and she was not permitted to see her daughter Alia for nearly 5 years after the marriage failed, with only one brief, strictly supervised 24-hour meeting in Istanbul in August 1957. Eventually, Access to Alia would be resumed after Hussein's second marriage, which I will talk about soon, and Dina was then invited to stay at the palace to see her daughter and began having regular meetings. Years later, Hussein visited Dina when she was seriously ill in a London hospital, and according to Dina's account, he apologised, saying, quote, "I am sorry." In 1960, King Hussein met Antoinette Tony Gardiner, the daughter of Lieutenant Colonel Walker P. Gardiner of the British Army's Royal Engineers. After meeting at a, quote, fancy dress party which he had arranged in his house at Shuna on the shores of the Dead Sea, according to one source, their relationship developed until on the 1st of May 1961 they married. Tony had previously converted to Islam, adopting the name Muna al-Hussein, Hussein's Delight, and adopting the title of princess instead of queen, possibly owing to suspicions regarding a foreigner becoming consort. She herself would give birth to 2 sons, Abdullah, the current king of Jordan, Faisal, and 2 daughters, Aisha and Zayn, and provided Hussein, quote, welcome domestic stability in the midst of the turbulence of regional politics. As mentioned before, Hussein faced many challenges in the 1950s, but the 1960s would continue to present crises as the king navigated the diplomatic issues of the Middle East. Nasser would continue to pose a threat to King Hussein, a threat made more serious by the union of Egypt and Syria, under the rule of Nasser in 1958, through a state called the United Arab Republic. Tensions were further amplified with the assassination of Jordanian Prime Minister Hassan Majali in August 1960 by Syrian agents, and the outbreak of the Yemeni civil war in 1962, with Nasser supporting the Republican side and Hussein backing the Royalists. Interestingly, Hussein, by siding with the Royalists in this conflict, Jordan began cooperating with the dynasty's old rivals, Saudi Arabia, and the 1960s marked an improvement in relations between the two kingdoms, possibly owing to the threat that Nasser posed to monarchies in the region. Tensions with Nasser were further accentuated in 1964, when in Cairo the decision was made at the First Arab Summit to back the creation of a new Palestinian entity, culminating in the foundation of the Palestinian Liberation Organization, the PLO, in Jerusalem of that year, with questions about whether this new entity would jeopardize Jordanian control of East Jerusalem and the West Bank, naturally being asked. Nevertheless, in spite of these very real tensions, Jordan and Egypt became increasingly aligned over the course of 1967. It seemed that war with Israel was on the horizon, and Jordan did not want to be seen as an outlier in relation to its Arab neighbours, in spite of its hesitancy for conflict. The 1964 Arab Summit, on top of leading to the foundation of the PLO, led to the formation of a United Arab Command, in which Egypt would be its leader. Finally then, a formal mutual defence treaty was signed in 1967 between Egypt and Jordan, with the Six-Day War breaking out on the 5th of June with a surprise Israeli attack on Egyptian forces. For all intents and purposes, the war was a disaster for the Arab states. Egypt lost control of the Sinai Peninsula. Syria, which had seceded from the United Arab Republic in 1961, lost the Golan Heights, and crucially for Jordan, it lost East Jerusalem and the West Bank. This area had accounted for between 35 to 40% of Jordan's gross national product, and would lead to an influx of between 175,000 and 250,000 refugees crossing the Jordanian River, on top of the destruction of 80% of the kingdom's armoured forces and its entire air force. While this conflict ironically marked a shift in Nasser's attitude to King Hussein, he recognised Jordan's sacrifice both in terms of people and land to the, quote, Arab cause. It also led to the most significant threat to King Hussein's continued rule since 1957. Deprived of the West Bank and East Jerusalem from which they operated from, Palestinian guerrilla groups, Fedayeen, moved their base of operations to Jordan itself and used it as a base to conduct raids on Israel from. In March 1968, the Battle of Kerama took place, in which both Jordanian forces and Fedayeen resisted an Israeli attack. Despite the joint nature of defence, it was seen as largely a propaganda win for Palestinian forces, with increasing Arab support being given to the movement thereafter, and allowing it to act in effect as a, quote, state within Jordan. This naturally threatened the rule of King Hussein, along with continued raids into the Israeli-occupied West Bank, which provoked retaliatory attacks on Jordan itself, whose military forces were still reeling from their defeat in 1967. By 1970, the situation was increasingly tense, with the stage set for a conflict between Palestinian forces within Jordan and the Jordanian authorities. Before I discuss the outbreak of this war, Black September as it became known as, we will take a short break with something that is a first for History House, an interview from August 1970 with King Hussein, just before the beginning of Black September. On top of hearing the voice of the subject of this episode, it also provides an insight into the build-up to the fight between the Fedayeen and Jordanian military, which will be useful for part 2 of the episode. So I hope you get something out of the next 2.5 minutes of this audio clip, and I'll see you all soon.
Your Majesty, are you optimistic at the moment about the chances of a successful peace settlement in the Middle East?
I must say I'm more so than I was some weeks ago. I believe there is a new initiative and there is a new movement. After the situation was left to deteriorate to a very dangerous point in terms of dangers to all concerned in the area and dangers to world peace.
Palestinian commandos in Amman have said that they regard the peace talks as a betrayal of their cause. How do you react to a statement like that?
I believe that no two countries in the Arab world have done more or likely to do more for the Palestinian cause and for the Arab cause, in fact, than Jordan and the United Arab Republic. And whenever we have taken any position, we have always had in mind our responsibilities as governments, our responsibilities towards our people in the occupied territories, our responsibilities towards the world. And I believe that this is basically been the case, and at the same time we are very happy with the positions that we have taken. We believe in them, and we believe that they are the only positions we should have taken up to now.
Is it in fact possible for you to have serious peace negotiations with Israel while the Palestinian commandos are using Jordan as a base from which to attack Israel?
I've always made it very clear, sir, that we can never be held responsible, nor will we consider ourselves responsible for resistance that takes place in the occupied territories, so long as they are occupied. And in fact, the growth of resistance has been a direct result of lack of progress towards the establishment of a just and durable peace in this area. Nobody wants to fight just for the sake of fighting, and I believe that our people are anxious to have a just, honorable, and durable peace in this area. We have never, up to this moment, and maybe even now, had the alternative to offer our people. There is a movement towards that end, and if and when we are able to offer them the alternative, I'm sure the overwhelming majority of our people will back us and be with us in our quest for a just, honorable, and durable peace in this area.
Welcome back. Before the break, I talked about the historical background to the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan, the early life of King Hussein I, and the challenges that he faced during his reign up until 1970, the beginning of Black September. While conflict was inevitable between King Hussein and the Palestinian Fedayeen within Jordan, a series of events led to its outbreak in September 1970. The first was the attempted assassination of King Hussein himself in June 1970, followed by another in September 1970 by the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, the PFLP, which was part of the wider PLO network. While such actions would naturally cause someone to spring to action, these actions by themselves did not result in the clampdown of the PLO that would eventually occur. Rather, It was the hijacking of commercial airliners to a desert airstrip near Zarqa in Jordan by the PFLP that same month. This was done as an attempt to secure the release of Palestinian prisoners both in Israel and Europe, and it would be largely seen as evidence of the powerlessness of the Jordanian authorities to exert its authority in the state within a state that was in effect run by the Palestinian Fedayeen. Consequently, on the 15th of September 1970, King Hussein appointed a military cabinet, and 2 days later the Jordanian army launched its assault on Fedayeen positions. The conflict escalated when on the 18th and 20th of September, taking advantage of the chaos in a neighbouring state, Syrian armoured units crossed the northern border into Jordan, heading towards Irbid, which the Fedayeen had declared a liberated area, adding a broader dimension that posed an even greater threat to Hussein's reign. While Britain was reluctant to get involved, the US was concerned about the potential overthrow of its pro-Western monarch, and it indicated to Israel that it would look favourably upon an Israeli air attack if a major Syrian invasion was confirmed. While this did not happen, it is certainly true that the Israeli Air Force played a deterrent role and allowed for the Jordanian military to drive back the Syrian forces between the 22nd and 23rd of September. Given what we discussed before, it is probably right that you are, at this moment, scratching your head as to why Israel indirectly intervened against Syria in its fight with Jordan. While a state of war continued to exist between Jordan and Israel, with the former seeking to gain back the territory it lost in 1967, the fact remained that the possible collapse of the monarchy in Jordan could have led to the de facto control of the country by the PLO. As such, any raids that had taken place on Israel by the PLO from Jordan before September 1970 would naturally have increased exponentially in the event of a PLO takeover, posing a risk to Israeli control of the occupied territories in East Jerusalem and the West Bank. There was also the fact that King Hussein was actively clamping down on the PLO, which created the perception that he could be a potential partner for peace in the future, something that is made more clear from his own secret contacts with Israel. On the 24th of September 1963, King Hussein met with the Deputy Director General of the Israeli Foreign Ministry, Yaakov Herzog, in London, beginning a series of indirect talks aimed at ending the conflict between the two sides. Contacts continued with Hussein meeting the then Foreign Minister of Israel, Golda Meir, in Paris in 1965, and even after the outbreak of the Six-Day War in 1967, the talks continued. Indeed, they became more important following on from this conflict, with King Hussein indicating that he was prepared to offer peace between Jordan and Israel in return for an Israeli withdrawal from East Jerusalem and the West Bank. While the Israeli side clearly did not agree to this, such gestures went a long way for the continued nature of these talks, which continued to remain secret. Hussein would later warn the Israeli Prime Minister, Golda Meir, about the likely outbreak of war during a covert meeting on the 25th of September 1973, less than 2 weeks before the Yom Kippur War, although the Israelis would not take the warning seriously. Given the possible disintegration of Jordan in the event of a PLO takeover, and the threat it posed, along with the perception among some Israeli officials of King Hussein as a potential future partner for peace through his secret talks, there is clearly a rationale here to explain Israel's indirect intervention against Syria in their attack on Jordan. In any case, the Jordanian authorities began to gain the upper hand against the PLO to the extent that by July 1971, Jordanian sovereignty was fully re-established, with the PLO moving their base of operations against Israel to Lebanon. In terms of the global dimensions to this conflict, the US became more reassured of Jordan as an ally, with King Hussein once again facing off a serious threat to his reign, while Jordan's standing in the Arab world was weakened. While Nasser would die suddenly on the 28th of September 1970, in the process of attempting to secure a ceasefire to this conflict, continued challenges to King Hussein from external actors would continue, as would Jordan's relations with Palestinians. Before Black September, the lines between what it meant to be Jordanian and Palestinian were increasingly blurred, which allowed for some degree of toleration towards the monarchy from Palestinians, both when East Jerusalem and the West Bank belonged to the kingdom, and afterwards when refugees and the PLO crossed the Jordanian River into Jordan proper. Afterwards, Jordanians became increasingly viewed as distinct from Palestinians, furthering the perception of difference between them, as well as the creation of a certain level of distrust and bitterness. This can be demonstrated with the formation of the Black September Organization, which assassinated the Jordanian Prime Minister Wasfi Tal in Cairo on November 28, 1971, and this organization would later carry out the Munich massacre the following year during the 1972 Olympic Games. For King Hussein, though, his continued reign, while not absent of threats, was now increasingly secured. He later described the conflict as, quote, a cancer operation that had to be performed to save Jordan's life, to the British ambassador to Jordan. Moving once again to his personal life, King Hussein would divorce his wife, Princess Muna, in 1972 and remarried again, this time to Alia Toukan, the daughter of a Jordanian diplomat. For all intents and purposes, it appears to have been a deep and loving marriage, leading to the births of two children, Princess Haya, born in 1974, and Prince Ali, born in 1975. Tragically, on the 9th of February 1977, Queen Alia was killed in a helicopter crash while visiting a hospital in southern Jordan. The main international airport in Amman is named in her honour. King Hussein himself would sink into a deep depression that only ended when he began a relationship with his fourth and final wife, Lisa Halaby, later Queen Noor, that would persist until his death in 1999. In terms of the late 1970s as a whole, the two major events that would have the most impact on the King were the Camp David Accords and the 1979 Iranian Revolution. The Camp David Accords were a peace settlement between Egypt and Israel, which ended the state of war between them in return for the Israeli withdrawal from the Sinai Peninsula. Personally, King Hussein was shocked and devastated by it. He felt that Anwar Sadat, Nasser's successor as president of Egypt, had went behind his back in agreeing to peace with Israel, with the accord mentioned Jordan no less than 14 times, even though King Hussein was not consulted. In short, it led to a downturn in relations with both Egypt and the US, with President Jimmy Carter cutting aid to Jordan from $40 million in 1978 to $20 million in 1980. Nonetheless, the idea of an Arab state refusing to agree peace with Israel was now broken. Turning to the Iranian Revolution, Hussein viewed the overthrow of the Shah of Iran as a personal blow. Indeed, he believed in the words of Nigel Ashton in his biography of the king, quote, a wider movement of idealists who had the best interests of their country at heart had been subverted by a clique of clerical demagogues. In terms of a direct quote from the king himself, he stated that Iran's new government was a, quote, anachronism and an insult to human rights, dignity, and the true teachings of Islam, end quote, and feared that its rhetoric and actions would only reinforce the divisions between Sunni and Shia Muslims across the Middle East. It is within this context that when the Iran-Iraq War broke out in 1980, King Hussein, while not intervening directly in the conflict, publicly supported Iraq. A surprising decision given the previously mentioned circumstances of the overthrow of its monarchy, and would mark the beginning of a friendship with its then ruler, a relationship that would later have negative consequences with Jordan's relations towards Western nations. This ruler was Saddam Hussein. At first born out of Sadat's rapprochement with Israel and the threat that revolutionary Iran posed to various Arab countries, the relationship would develop over time to the extent that when the Iran-Iraq War 1980 to 1988 broke out, King Hussein openly supported his Arab counterpart and would dispatch the Yarmouk Brigade in 1982 to assist Iraq. Although, given the fact that Jordanian forces were largely equipped with US weaponry, permission had to be sought from the Reagan administration, which was denied. As such, the 1980s have been referred to as the, quote, decade of the two Husseins, with King Hussein visiting Baghdad no less than 61 times during this period. That being said, King Hussein's foreign policy during this period was not solely focused on Iraq. For example, Jordan eventually fostered a rapprochement with Egypt in February 1984, when King Hussein met President Hosni Mubarak in Washington, D.C. He had succeeded Anwar Sadat in 1981, following his assassination. This was important as Jordan was the first Arab nation to restore diplomatic ties with Egypt following the Camp David Accords, with Jordan later hosting the Arab League Summit of 1987, greatly improving its standing when we consider its relations with other Arab states following Black September in 1970. Another flashpoint during this decade was Israel's invasion of Lebanon in 1982, Operation Peace for Galilee, part of the wider Lebanese civil war, which lasted from 1975 to 1990. As mentioned before, the PLO moved their base of operations to Lebanon following their defeat in Jordan in 1971, and while Lebanon did not border Jordan, events unfolding there did have consequences for the kingdom. On top of being appalled by the sheer humanitarian catastrophe unfolding there, King Hussein was alarmed by the views of the Israeli defense and foreign ministers, Ariel Sharon and Yitzhak Shamir, who encouraged the displacement of Palestinians to Jordan, which would have created a similar situation to 1970 and would have provided Israel with a casus belli for military intervention. Indeed, Ariel Sharon attempted to persuade Yasser Arafat to return the PLO to Jordan, offering to force Hussein to make way for this, but this would be rejected by Arafat, who stated that Jordan was not the home of Palestinians. In light of these developments, Hussein sent his cousin Zayed bin Shakir on a secret mission to Washington at the end of July 1982. Shakir's mission was to seek a reaffirmation of America's military and political support for Jordan, and to convey Hussein's fear that Israel intended to overthrow him and to create a Palestinian state in Jordan. Secretary of State George Shultz reportedly reassured Shakir of American support for Jordan's independence and territorial integrity, thus ensuring that any rhetoric by Israeli officials was just that, and would not amount to action and intervention. Domestically, two key events would take place towards the end of the 1980s. The first was the eruption of the First Intifada, or uprising, in 1987 by Palestinians against Israeli rule. Fearing the spread of unrest, King Hussein formally made the decision on the 31st July 1988 to sever the legal and administrative links between the Hashemite Kingdom and the West Bank, and would reluctantly recognise the PLO as the sole legitimate representative of the Palestinian people. This was a key development in relations between Jordanians and Palestinians, making the distinction between the two peoples official, culminating a process that had begun in the aftermath of Black September. The second key domestic event was the 1989 riots in Jordan. Beginning with public discontent, the man-bred riots in April 1989 forced Hussein to accept the government's resignation and initiated a process of political liberalisation, including the first general elections since 1956. This period would see the beginning of democratic reforms, including the eventual ending of martial law, enacted in 1957 in the 1990s. The 1990s, the final decade of King Hussein's life, is seen publicly as the representation of his peace initiatives, but initially this decade did not appear promising for him. Iraq's invasion of Kuwait in 1990, following the stalemate of the Iran-Iraq War, shocked the king, but his decision to stay neutral in the conflict would negatively impact his standing, at least for a period of time, considering the fact that the coalition against Saddam Hussein included Jordan's neighbours, Saudi Arabia, Syria, and Egypt particularly, playing a major role. Nonetheless, this isolation would be short-lived, as developments in peace talks with Israel would greatly improve his standing again, at least in the Western world. The election of Yitzhak Rabin as Prime Minister of Israel in 1992 allowed for talks to develop, culminating in the Oslo Accords of 1993. While the agreement between Israel and the PLO initially angered King Hussein, owing to lack of consultations with Jordan, it, like Egypt's acceptance of the Camp David Accords, allowed for the real possibility of a peace agreement on Jordan's part, which was finally realised with the signing of the Jordanian-Israeli Peace Treaty on the 26th of October 1994, which was described by King Hussein himself as his, quote, crowning achievement. Rabin and Hussein appear to have developed a close relationship, and naturally, when Rabin was gunned down by a right-wing fanatic in November 1995, the King of Jordan was beyond devastated. His attendance at Rabin's funeral in Jerusalem would be especially poignant for the monarch, considering that in the very same city he had witnessed the assassination of his own grandfather in 1951, and he himself would deliver a eulogy. I will read some of his words, which came across as extremely heartfelt by many people attending the funeral. Quote, "I never thought that the moment would come like this, when I would grieve the loss of a brother, a colleague and a friend, a man, a soldier, who met us on the opposite side of a divide, who we respected as he respected us, a man I came to know because I realised as he did that we had to cross over the divide. I have never been used to standing, except with you next to me, speaking of peace, speaking about dreams and hopes for generations to come. You lived as a soldier, you died as a soldier for peace, and I believe it is time for all of us to come out openly and speak of peace, not here today, but for all times to come." End quote. Unfortunately, this genuine friendship between the King of Jordan and an Israeli Prime Minister would not last. Following on from a brief tenure by Shimon Peres, who replaced Rabin, the 1996 Israeli general election led to the ascension to power of a man who was very familiar to those who followed the news with his first stint as Israeli Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu. Despite initially appearing open to Netanyahu's premiership, relations, while not sinking to outright ending, did see a tremendous decline. Netanyahu's support for Israeli settlement building in occupied territory and his opposition to Palestinian statehood explained this partly, but two events in particular would go a long way in demonstrating the sharp departure from the rapport King Hussein had had with Yitzhak Rabin. The first was the Jerusalem Tunnel incident in September 1996. Netanyahu's order to open the tunnel near the Al-Aqsa Mosque was strongly opposed by Jordan and was seen as a blatant Israeli violation of the Peace Treaty's clause, recognising Jordan's special role in Muslim holy sites in Jerusalem. Hussein felt personally deceived because Netanyahu's aide had met him shortly before without explaining the plan. This incident caused Hussein to rebuff all attempts by Netanyahu to re-establish personal contact until mediation occurred. The second incident was the attempted assassination of Khalid Meshal in Jordan in September 1997. Meshal, a prominent member of Hamas, was poisoned by Mossad agents who entered Jordan using fake Canadian passports. Aside from being seen as an affront to Jordanian sovereignty, King Hussein also viewed it as a personal slap in the face, given that the orders had been given by Netanyahu himself. On top of demanding the immediate release of an antidote to save Meshal's life, the severing of ties with Israel became a very real possibility, and King Hussein would threaten that unless the Mossad agents responsible for this assassination attempt were handed over to the Jordanian authorities, the king would order the storming of the Israeli embassy in Amman. This of course did not happen, and Mishal himself would survive, and ties between Jordan and Israel, while heavily strained, would continue to persist. While there is much that could be discussed in terms of other key events in the life of King Hussein in the 1990s, including the king's sudden rupture in relations with his Iraqi namesake and previous friend, for the purposes of time, I will now discuss the end of King Hussein's life. In 1998, the king was diagnosed with non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, and after receiving treatment at the Mayo Clinic, he returned to Jordan in January 1999. However, the disease reappeared, and despite an effort to return him back to the United States for treatment, the decision was made for him to die at home. Crucially, in his final weeks, he decided to remove his brother, Prince Hassan, as crown prince, and instead replaced him with his own son, Abdullah. His choice appears to have been done on the basis of his son's education in the US, which would naturally help in maintaining the strong relationship between the two nations, as well as Abdullah's ties with the military. He was the commander of special operations. Ties which, as we have seen, helped King Hussein maintain power throughout his reign. Following this decision, King Hussein would pass away on the 7th of February 1999, while facing Mecca. His funeral would be attended by a wide variety of dignitaries, some of whom were outright enemies. Alongside President Bill Clinton, who King Hussein had formed a strong friendship with, there was also Yasser Arafat, Hafez al-Assad of Syria, Netanyahu, and even Ariel Sharon. Efforts were made to avoid the Israeli delegation from standing next to Arab states, who were still theoretically at war with Israel. Indeed, following the funeral on the 9th of February, a memorial service would be held for him at St. Paul's Cathedral in London on the 5th of July, an event made even more important considering that it was the first time a foreign monarch had been so honoured there since before World War I, and the first time that the Quran was read in St. Paul's. With this final act, the quote, line of Jordan was finally allowed to rest in peace after an extraordinary life. To conclude, King Hussein of Jordan was clearly a ruler of many contrasts. Despite his ties with the Jordanian military, he is best remembered for his efforts for peace, something that would be viewed as a betrayal by Palestinians, especially when we also consider the events of Black September. At the same time, Jordan, under his rule, became a key player in the Arab world, and in spite of his disagreements with various leaders, the presence at his funeral of friends and former foes is a testament to the respect that he commanded, both in the Middle East and beyond. Most importantly, though, I feel that the word, however cliched, that can best describe King Hussein is survivor. When we consider the overthrow of monarchies across the Middle East, especially the overthrow of the Iraqi monarchy in 1958, King Hussein's continued rule was a testament to his political skills, even if his maintaining of power was done at times with the support of the military. Indeed, whereas other nations in the region have fallen victim to internal conflict and violence in the years after King Hussein's death, the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan has maintained a reputation for stability. This, I believe, is an important legacy of King Hussein, and in some ways it is perhaps a good thing that Jordan is not more well known around the world, owing to the public association of the region with turmoil, and thus furthering the sense of Jordan as a stable nation in spite of this. That being said, the cultures of this region, in spite of this perception, remain rich and diverse, while the people there remain, dare I say, human, like everyone else around the world. This, I feel, in the world of late May 2025, is something that is increasingly lost in the news that we see every day, and the rhetoric of hate that is being spread alongside this. Therefore, while peace is very much the most important legacy of King Hussein of Jordan, it seems tragically distant in the world of 2025 when we remember his consequential peace with Israel in 1994. That's all for today. I hope that this episode has allowed you to get a better sense of the history of Jordan through King Hussein, as well as an understanding of the Middle East as a whole, perhaps challenging previously held notions and ideas. As some of you may know from History House's social media, I allowed you, my audience, to vote on the next episode. I can reveal that Lafcadio O'Hearn received the most votes, and that his story will be the subject of June's episode. A Greek-Irish writer who in effect opened Japan to the West in terms of its myths and ghost stories. A big thank you to everyone who voted. Before finally signing off, I would like to say that the 2nd of June, a few days from now, marks a year since the release of the first History House episode. Since this date, History House has expanded beyond Spotify to include Apple Podcasts and YouTube, as well as releasing content beyond the initial podcast on its social media channels. From a simple suggestion from a student when I was teaching English to start a history podcast, I could not imagine how this project would become part of my life, or indeed how much you, my audience, would come to enjoy it. I would like to thank you all for being with me on this journey, for your comments, and simply just by listening. It really does mean a lot to me. Let's see how the next year develops, and I have some interesting ideas about upcoming episodes, which I hope you can join me for, as this podcast goes from strength to strength. So, with all that said, there's nothing more for me to say other than my well-known words, which I mean more than ever now. Keep her lit.